Hello and welcome to New South Wales Archives 2022 regional webinar series about schools and teachers. These are images from the first bundle of the West Wyalong school file showing the school site as chosen in 1894. In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Hello West Wyalong and Wyalong, because of course you can't really talk about one without talking about the other. And it's fabulous to be with you, at least virtually. And thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are. The Archives on Tour program is one of the ways that we engage across the state. Two of the other ways is through our regional network and our touring exhibitions. This is the third year of Archives on Tour, even though one of those years took 2 years to eventuate. And we actually visited towns in the first year, and we hope we'll do that again. But this year it's all about schools and teachers. So we're going to virtually bring you some archives about the schools and the teachers of West Wyalong and Wyalong, talk about the series of archives and how you can find them on our website and how to access the archives. There'll be time for questions. You can add those through the chat function. Out of the literally millions of archives, we'll pick just a few to show you. Now, Archives on Tour has its own pages on our website, so you can browse the digital versions of the archives, and there are more pages there than I can show you today. So do make sure you go to those pages. There's a shortcut at the moment from our homepage. So where are we going and where have we been? We've been to Ulladulla and Coonabarabran. Emily and I are very well travelled, and today we're in West Wyalong. This is a great plan for additions made to the Wyalong Public School in 1921. I wanted to start by talking about two fantastic sources for the things we're talking about today. Among the many things the Department of Education website has, it includes this fantastic source about the history of New South Wales government schools. You can search for a place name to see if there was ever a school. And if there was a school, you can find out what sort of school it was. It also explains all of the different types of school and provides other background information about education. And of course our website, New South Wales State Archives website, www.records.nsw.gov.au. We have lots and lots of state archives about schools and teachers. We're just going to be concentrating on a small proportion of the literally kilometres of archives. One of the really wonderful things is a lot of the state archives we'll be looking at today were actually created in the schools by the teachers who I suspect would be amazed that they still exist today. These are the four series of records, the school files, which as you can see cover 1880 to 1976. Fantastic, cover virtually the whole state, big towns, small towns, towns that grew, towns that didn't grow. The photographic collection, teacher career cards covering 1908 to 1987, and the site register cards covering 1930 to 2000. And there are thousands of schools. In 2020, there was over 2,000 schools, and since 1848, there have been well over 7,000 schools and over 30 different types of schools. They often have a central role in towns, big or small. They reflect and are impacted by global events like wars, statewide events like drought and depression, and of course I should be mentioning flood now. Schools are involved in and create their own local events, which play out across their town. They reflect their locations, coastal towns, dairying areas, railway towns, mining towns like the Wyalong towns, small towns and towns that become cities. The school files are created by bringing together all of the correspondence about each school. The correspondence is from everyone, teachers, parents, the education department and district officers, other government departments, local members of parliament, education ministers, local councils, parents and citizens groups and other local organisations. Up until about the 1930s, there's huge levels of detail, but from 1940 onwards, they don't contain as much detailed information about teachers and may have very little about the teachers. And they're also much more official in tone because, as you'll see, many of the school files are anything but official in tone. These are the schools that we're talking about. So West Wyalong Public School and Wyalong Public School both started in 1894. The West Wyalong High School started in 1963. There's similarities between all of the school files. As I said, they reflect their times, the wars, particularly World War I's, well represented, women having to resign if they marry in the 1930s into the 1940s, depressions, expanding and decreasing populations, but also that reflection of the town. And the discovery of gold is what drove the growth and the need for schools in the Wyalong area. By the 1920s, mining was over, and you can see the different shape of the towns coming through in the school files. Some school files are up to 15 boxes of papers. Some are only a couple of centimetres thick. So I've just selected a very small quantity of papers from each of these schools. They've been digitised and put on the West Wyalong Archives on Tour School Records webpage. So let's look at some of those pages. After gold was discovered in 1893, the Department of Public Instruction, forerunner of the Department of Education, moved to secure sites for a school, or maybe two schools. There was always a local inspector, and some of them just produced amazing work. And I think that Inspector Thomas is one of those. He visited both of the beginning towns in March 1894, both the government township and the mining camp as they were thought of then. These documents are from the West Wyalong school file, but as the beginnings of Wyalong and West Wyalong schools are so intertwined, I've brought those pages together. The number you can see in the box, the 5/18216.2, is the bundle of papers that you'll be able to find these documents on. And in the end, Inspector Thomas secured two sites. So he says, I've just returned from Wyalong, where I've selected two sites. Whether they are available or not, I'm unable to say until I hear from the government surveyor and the mining warden's clerk. Owing to the fact that the main miners' camp is 2.5 miles distant, and that is impossible at present to say whether they will leave it for the surveyed township, I deemed it advisable to secure 2 acres wherein their camp. The situation of the camp is on sanitary grounds, most unsuitable, and strenuous efforts will be made by the authorities to induce the business people to move to higher ground. As yet, there are a few women and children on the field, and as permanent buildings of any description, the recent wet weather has reduced the roads to a deplorable condition and will retard building operations for weeks. So he's looked at both the already slightly laid out government town and where most of the people were, which is near the mines at what became West Wyalong. This is from the Wyalong school file. Neither place had done much to apply for a school to be established, it seems. At this point, Inspector Thomas doesn't expect West Wyalong to be the permanent town. So he visited both places. He sent the usual blank forms of application 4 weeks ago. Little's been done to get signatures. So basically to get a school, you filled out an application form and you got signatures from parents who also listed their children and their ages and their religion. So at Wyalong, he actually took the schedule around and obtained the names of pupils of school age and thought that there were probably many others that were procurable. It's very difficult to gauge the requirements of each place in point of size of building to be provided. So I'm as likely to recommend too small a building as to make the opposite mistake. However, I'm of the opinion that a substantial building, easy of enlargement and capable of accommodating 100 children should be erected at Wyalong, and that 2 acres should be fenced. At Wyalong West, a building of a temporary nature capable of receiving 60 or 80 pupils will, I think, meet requirements. But again, talking about reserving the sites. So these are snips out of the 2 applications. West Wyalong, who's dated the 28th of March 1894, and Wyalong the 1st of June 1894. So in West Wyalong at that point there was already 3 private schools with 98 children attending. The general feeling was that once the government schools were started, the private schools would decrease. Most of the children, or a majority of the children, were Roman Catholic, and the proposed site has already been surveyed. As for Wyalong, temporary school held in a tent, number attending not known, so he's estimating a bit the number of children. They've selected section 32 because the town's already been surveyed as the most suitable and excellent site set apart by the surveyor for public school purposes. Then the inspector does a report on the applications for the school. So he sat down and wrote the two reports on the same day, and of course he's been there. So his estimate of West Wyalong's population is 2,000 to 6,000. He thinks it will continue to grow as a town, but just not as big a one as Wyalong, and feels that that will surpass it in size. And one of the questions they always asked, and particularly for a mining town, is it likely to be permanently inhabited? So for West Wyalong says yes, but not to such an extent as at present. The situation is very unhealthy. Remember, he visited after lots of rain, and the sanitary conditions most deplorable, and it was a mining camp. Every effort is being made to induce people to move to Wyalong, which is 3.5 miles distance. The people are wholly miners and business people. So with Wyalong, yep, the bulk of the residents are engaged in gold mining. There's not a lot of difference there. The others are business people. I think that the township will ultimately surpass Wyalong West in size and importance. And then these are from his concluding part of his reports. He does talk about the rivalry that existed between the towns. The end result, of course, is that both towns got a school, regardless of whether, where there were enough children, they felt, and that's certainly confirmed by what happened next. So as West Wyalong got his application in first, I thought would continue with West Wyalong. Oh, and the last thing that he did, not only does he have nearly readable handwriting, he could do sketches. I think these sketches alone, so these are done by a person who's actually on the ground describing what he's seeing, even if he's looking perhaps through slightly slanted government eyes of where things were. So there's the main street through camp. The track continues on to Wyalong. Wyalong, as you can see, has been surveyed, nice regular streets, and the school site marked up the top in red and describes the vegetation around both of these sites. The school was ready on the 22nd of August 1894, so remember in West Wyalong, and the teacher, Thomas Thompson, was appointed. They didn't build a residence. Now, it was really common for the head teacher to have a residence, and that was a problem almost in any town, but particularly in a booming mining town. So there was a problem always with trying to get somewhere to live. So the numbers initially were not as high as expected. So you can see the numbers there that the average attendance in the first week of September was 52.6. And, it did go up 73.9, 72.8, 82.7, but still not as high. So he's talking about the reasons why. So this is now the teacher who's been appointed. That the fear of a water famine in the summer has caused some families to leave and prevented others from coming. That the insecure title to land mitigates greatly against the erection of buildings and the consequent arrival of the miners' families, because miners are going to put up with rougher conditions than wanting to perhaps bring their families into. There's insufficient crushing facilities, which leaves thousands of tonnes of stone at grass, in inverted commas. Hence, wages are unpaid and miners have no means where to pay for the expense of moving wives and children who are obviously parked somewhere else, quite possibly in Temora. And quite a lot of the population belonged to the Catholic Church. This is a letter from the Department of Mines in February 1894 saying 7 months ago it was a novelty to see a child. Mr. Collar referred to the field as it was 7 months ago when to see a child was a great novelty, but the increase in population has been growing so rapidly that at the present time the names of 175 children upon the roll. And the increasing numbers, he found that the accommodation would have to be very much increased. especially as if it was bidding fair to become a permanent one and the people were flocking in daily. Did point out that it's very hot and that at the school there's no shade or covering the yard for the children. So please get on and talk to someone, the Minister for Public Instruction, about it. The enrolments continued to increase and the teacher plus 2 temporary assistants were not sufficient. Henry Ellis was appointed in 1895 as a temporary assistant. Teachers were moved regularly and they were allowed to, if they didn't request the move, they were allowed to claim for travelling expenses. And they again give you this picture on how transport operated in that time. So at the time before coming to West Wyalong, he was at North Wagga. So he had a cab fare and the removal of baggage from North Wagga to Wagga Railway Station, the railway fare from Wagga to Temora, the coach fare from Temora to Wyalong, and then the incidental expenses on the way, including a night at Cootamundra, all of which only cost £1.13, which I'm sure to him was quite an amount and obviously wasn't considered excessive. They've checked that it was a second-class rail fare and he got paid that. The school continued to grow as did the town. And an evening school was established in 1897. Now, evening public schools were created to provide an elementary, so like a primary level of education for persons over 14 years of age who previously received little to no education. They offered young men, women could, but very few females ever enrolled, 2 hours of instruction 3 nights a week. So it's a big commitment. They were usually conducted in the local public school building by the headmaster or other teachers. Most schools were poorly attended, so the one at West Wyalong on this first attempt lasted until 1899. So again, there was an application, there had to be a list of who was going to be available, was it going to be viable? In question 8, state what you know respecting the circumstances of those whom the school is intended. They're young men, chiefly employed during the day as surface hands at the mines or in business places in the township. And it does give you, and you'll see, depending on the age of the person, that their parent had to sign. So we've got a groom, a chemist's assistant, a groom, 2 shop boys, a whip driver, a counter hand, coach boy in office, compositor, blacksmith, miner, driving horse, wood cutting, miners. So that, again, that raise of occupations in the town at that time, but also the age of the people carrying them out. Training teachers was an evolving process. So up until 1905, most teachers in government schools were trained on the job as pupil teachers, who usually began their 4-year course aged between the ages of 13 and 16. So during school hours, pupil teachers taught a class full-time, and then each day outside of school hours, they were instructed in teaching method and content by the head teacher. You wonder how the teachers had time. So this is 1902, and Elizabeth Fraser, that's her letter on the left. You'll note what lovely handwriting she does, has failed her French exam and has written to ask if she could please have another try. So it was caused by being very much upset and worried through a family bereavement which occurred on the first day of my examination, which was the 16th of December. And her father actually died. It was her father. The fact, I think, that she had a really good testimony from a teacher helped in obtaining the opportunity to do the second attempt. So Miss Fraser has been specially, on the left, have the honour to state in reply to your letter on the above subject that I attribute Miss Fraser's failure in examination in December past to the death of her father, which occurred about the same time. It appears that a great attachment between father and daughter existed. As his life was despaired of for some weeks beforehand, her mental anguish was prolonged. Cannot speak too highly of Miss Fraser as an earnest pupil teacher, and she shows signs of becoming a teacher of no ordinary ability. So she was granted a second attempt and she did pass. So this is Elizabeth Fraser, that Elizabeth Fraser's teacher career card. We'll be talking about them in a bit more detail later. This system of cards began around 1908 and continued until 1987. As you can imagine, there's thousands. So you can see Elizabeth was born in 1884, so in 1902 she was about 18. On the left-hand side, you'll see two numbers up beside her name. The system before the teacher career cards are called the teacher's rolls. So that tells us that on page 438 of roll 7, there's an entry for Elizabeth Fraser. There's an index to those on our website, but they've also been digitised and available through Ancestry. So you can see that Elizabeth Fraser was the Wyalong West, as it was known, when these cards were started in 1908, and we know that she was there in 1902, so she'd been there for quite some time. She moved on to Grenfell in September 1910 and then resigned in 1912. It doesn't say why. There's nothing on the back of the card. She may have married, found a better job, all sorts of reasons. The variety of non-teaching matters that are covered by the school files is really fascinating. In 1906, on the left, there's a letter from one of the architects from the Department of Education. A range of repairs were recommended for the school residents. Buildings are of wood and have not been repaired since erection some years ago and are much in want of several repairs and painting. School buildings is 11 foot long, so lots of details about what needs to be done. Kitchen hearth is broken away and the stove burnt out in front so that the fire falling out might cause the destruction of the building. So not at all good. The middle one, they're recommending that the fence around the school be paled. So it was a post and rail fence, but what they wanted was it to be completely enclosed to prevent the goats from taking the children's dinners. And there was always, it seems, a disease to deal with. In this case, it was an outbreak of measles at Wyalong West. Attack of measles began about the last week of May when a few isolated cases were reported. They estimate about 150 pupils of this school are either absent from sickness or because of isolation. It's been reported to Mr. Skinner, who was one of the inspectors. Even the pupil teacher got it. And he's been causing all families to isolate, which, you know, where we sit in terms of COVID, it all sounds very familiar. There'd been an attempt in 1908 to get another evening school to go, but failed. But in 1911, a night school opened in April 1911, and you can see there's quite a good list of people who are interested: farmers, clerk, grocer, blacksmith, telephonist, farmer, clerk, gardener, contractor, all sorts of things. But it closed in August 1911 when the teacher resigned. So basically he said, asked for permission to resign the position of the evening school from the 13th approximate owing to the institution of evening drills and the opening of 2 more picture shows. The attendance has become too small to recompense me for my trouble, because the teachers were paid to do that. So lots of conflicting things to take your attention away from learning. Once World War I starts across most of the school files, there are changes in what happens in the schools and in the towns. So on the left, you can see a letter from the Belgian Special Appeal Fund. Have the honour on behalf of my committee to respectfully request that the children of the public school of West Wyalong be granted a half holiday from 12 o'clock noon on Belgian Day for the purpose of enabling them to join the celebrations that have been decided to be held at West Wyalong. There's a note to say that all schools were closed. Having a little bit of a look into, in terms of gathering war money for patriotic funds, initially it was just donated directly to the organising committee, but as the war progressed, the greater part was raised by nominating special days for street collections. Belgian Day, held on the 15th of May 1915, was the first of these special days, and across New South Wales it rose over £100,000. And you'll see mention of it in many schools. On the right, the resignation of a teacher in 1919 prompted the headmaster to request another teacher, setting out the classes and the teachers available. So Mrs. Richards has got 44 students in her first classes. Mr. Sutherland is teaching second and third class, which gives him over 50 children. Miss Cupid, an unclassified teacher, and an ex-student, 33. And notes that several of these students have been excluded for infectious diseases and temporary abstinence in the country. And now the local pneumonia influenza cases are improving. The attendance and enrolment should increase after normal conditions. Most of the heads spent a lot of their time writing about the need for extra staff as staff came and went. During the war years and through into 1919, because it took that long for the soldiers to come back, the school fares often have these sorts of requests. So requests for a leave of absence to see relatives off to the war or to meet them when they return. So this is Mrs. Richards, who was teaching the kindergarten, and she's requesting leave to meet her husband on his return from the war. So he's returning to service by the SS Ontario due about the 7th of August. And owing to the military notice being short, I'm unable to comply with the usual regulations for a fortnight's notice. The West Wyalong PNC and the Parents and Citizens Associations across the state are well represented in the school files. Wrote to the Minister of Education in 1919 about a range of matters. They wanted a new building instead of just patching and extending the original building, which was only intended to meet requirements of a floating population when mining was the chief industry. So they're already moving beyond that mining town image in their minds. And that plans should be made to extend the building, should include the provision for secondary classes. And they also talked about the increasing size and importance of West Wyalong and the decreasing size of Wyalong by the, I thought, clever but unusual way of doing it by comparing the revenue from the sanitary services. So the sanitary services cost the same in both of the towns. So between 1914 and 1916, the cost, in 1914, the revenue from the sanitary service of Wyalong was £406, and in 1918, 365. Whereas in West Wyalong, it went up from 575 to 590, and it's charged at the same rate. So quite clever, but quite unusual, I felt. A later request for secondary classes included this detailed map showing where the children attending the super classes at Wyalong lived, super primary classes at Wyalong lived. You can see one pupil lives 3 miles from West Wyalong in this direction. He has never attended West Wyalong Public School. One girl lives some miles out, but boards in town. She has attended but one day. Her residence is not shown. But again, an on-the-spot map of the towns and some of the things in them where people lived. There's a shop. I think that's a drill hall to the left of the shop. It never ceases to amaze me, the sorts of things that you're going to find about a town in a school file. Teachers applied for a broad range of reasons. Miss Irving Wishart applied for a leave of absence as an opportunity to spend a year on a cattle station in Central Australia had come up. So she said, please could I have a year off, or if not, then I'll resign. And they said, leave declined, we're confirming your resignation. She did return to teaching later. And more sadly, far more sombre reasons. So Miss Dulcie Prittle was a teacher at West Wyalong Public School and died in 1927 from pneumonic influenza. She was only 25. The head teacher, John Frank, excluded the 2 teachers who were close contacts from the school initially until they received medical advice otherwise. And then this is various snips from one of the teachers, James Russell, who it turned out, as he said, Miss Prittle and I are engaged, though such was not public. Both the head and the inspector recommend that the leave be applied for be granted without pay. Yesterday afternoon, Mr. Russell was not in a fit state to remain on duty. Today he was in a worse state of distress. He was the sole company of the parents of the late Miss Purnell on their return with the body to Kangaroo Valley. Both are elderly and ill. So this is John Frank, that headmaster's career card. West Wyalong was his first school as a headmaster. As you can see, the cards that are used a lot, and it's lost part of the information, but you can see to the right of his name, the 6 and the /626. So he was a teacher prior to the cards being started. He was born on the 1st of March 1883. The B/C probably stands for born in the colony, which is something that I'm more used to seeing on gel photographic description books. When the card started, he was working at Blackfriars Public School, and his career is a mix of Sydney suburbs and country towns. West Wyalong appears, and by that stage it's a district school in 1924, and he was there through until 1929 when he was moved, or he requested to move to Abermain. On the back of the card, down the bottom, you can see that his life assurance. You had to insure your life when you became a teacher, and his appointment was confirmed. And when you got married, you can see he's got a name in the married box up the top, you gave full details. So he was married to Miss Harriet Buckland on the 23rd of September 1922 at Sydney by the Reverend P.A. Nicholson, Church of England, and the marriage certificate number. So you actually sent in your marriage certificate so that they had absolute proof that you were married. Some parts of the work of a school, while still work, were about fun. So on the left, seeking permission to send sporting teams to Temora for competitions, and that reoccurred over a few years. Later on, it seemed to be Ungari, and I apologise if I've mispronounced that, where they went for those days. Celebrating Empire Day, which was usually a program of events at the school, followed by a half day. And the regulation day off for the local show, but only one of the local shows. So if there was 2 shows, you had to pick one. So the date of the show, he notes that the 3rd is the big day. The town's West Wyalong, it's the West Wyalong annual show. Number of days 2, and yet pretty much routinely the children got their day off. Didn't happen in Sydney, I'm telling you. Other parts of their life was much harder. Writing memos for extra staff. Wish to point out that for the past 4 weeks, there has been a vacancy on this staff, which has necessitated a junior teacher being in charge of 93 small children housed in separate rooms. That would be another thing which was no fun, being that junior teacher. Or on the right, and this occurs across a range of places, when numbers were high, accommodation was tight, making the decision to exclude children under 6 years of age owing to the lack of accommodation. So you'd talk to your local inspector and then write for permission to refuse admission to all new pupils under the age of 6 years owing to the lack of accommodation. First class has an enrolment of 70, a daily attendance of 56 to 60, while there is seating for just 56. So if all 70 turned up, it would be difficult. On the left, this is a bit of fun. Sport, of course, is so important in all levels of Australian society, I think. And many regional areas had the really important sporting cup. So the Mar Cup was the Rugby League Cup in that group, and it was obviously very important. So the local member was called into, Mr. Buttonshaw, was called in to write to the minister in a personal and urgent way to say, will you interview Minister Education permission prior leave to play Mar Cup Wednesday afternoon? This football match associated with the Mar Cup is a very important fixture in the Wyalong and surrounding districts. So could he have special leave just for that afternoon? And they've said no, leave is granted only for interstate and international matches. So obviously a question they've been asked before. Staffing was still a problem, as you can see on the other side. The two teachers that are bracketed are the temporary teachers, and most of the classes are in excess of 30 students, if not more. The 1930s seems to have been a real time of change. So the P&C had very kindly paid for the electric light and power to be installed to the school in 1932, and they'd paid the bill for that, for the electricity, until 1935. And this is, I think, the inspector saying that perhaps at this point, the headmaster has now asked if the association might be relieved of this charge. It's pointed out the account is always the minimum, i.e. 10 shillings per quarter. The regular meetings of the Parents and Citizens Associations are held in a local hall, so it's not as though they were using the electricity. And so the department did take it on. But in this time, the school also got a telephone, and town water and sewerage were paid on. And by the end of the school file that I was looking at, the P&C had bought a film projector for visual education. It was the subject of much toing and throwing of letters about what to buy. It was quite regular, they don't all seem to have survived, for the education department to send out a 2-page form, basically, to say, tell us about your rooms, your classes, who's on the roll, how big is the room, and then to do a plan on the back. This is a good one. I've seen some absolute shockers. Those teachers should not have taught drawing, whereas whoever did this one. But it also shows you that in 1937, it's quite a substantial school. It's got a manual workroom, it's got an separate infants building, and quite substantial looking U-shaped main building. It is a district school, so by that means that it did offer things like manual work and science, as you can see down on the left-hand side of the U, and would have taken students into what was basically secondary education. In 1940, the minister visited West Wyalong and met with various people, and he was confronted with a range of really interesting questions, I feel, for a minister. They talked about the super primary section of the school, pointed to evidence that parents and citizens' interest in the school had what it had done, so visual education, manual training equipment, lots of things, and it's really obvious they contributed. They needed a teacher with library experience to control library development, raising the status to an intermediate high school. Mr. Evans supported, so Mr. Evans is a local person. The suggestion with the teacher librarians was that the teachers could spend their holidays learning about libraries, and then they could do that in their spare time. But they also asked him about the library boxes, the size of the library boxes. The dividing shelf had been fixed in the dead centre of the box, but the minister fortunately did have an answer to that. So we're going to talk about West Wyalong High School now. Of course, it opens in 1963, so it's in the period where there's none of that wonderful personal detail, or very little, and a lot of it is about land and buildings. The Department of Education did often plan ahead, and so as early as 1953 had acquired a high school site in West Wyalong, and you can see that on the map. And so basically across the road from the West Wyalong Public Hospital. Many people assumed, however, because there was spare land beside the primary school, that that would be a good site. As it became clear that a high school would be built sooner rather than later, people began to consider in more earnest about where it should be. The headmaster spends a lot of time thinking about all of these sorts of things, and in essence, it became obvious there were lots of issues with the site near the hospital. It's not central in relation to the town's settlement. Would involve additional running for the school bus service. Town children would have to cross the rail line on foot or by bicycle, which is obviously a source of danger. Considerable distance from the town's recreation area, which is available for the pupils' use on sports day. And there's an excellent site just adjacent to the public school. It also became obvious that the hospital, once they realised that's what that land was reserved for, weren't keen. They thought it would add noise and congestion. So the plan is of the primary school with its residents in the corner and the recreation ground beside it to the left and above on the left. And what they could do if they could just get the land, which is in the top right-hand corner, which was privately owned. And ultimately that's what they did get. The P&C, as they had often done, mounted their case. Should be in West Wyalong. This is, you know, West Wyalong's P&C talking after all. No competing high schools in the Shire or adjacent excepting at Temora and Cootamundra. Great potential source of students is from the north and west, at present unserved. Many high school children are sent away for secondary education because there isn't one. Taking into account students that are sent away for education, most of these could be attracted back. There are well over 200 students of high school age enrolled at West Wyalong, and there are expected to be 300 by 1963. In addition, there are the students that are already being brought in from the district villages of Barmedman and Ungari for certain subjects. It's well situated on the junction of the highways. It's got, it doesn't mention the rail links. Present rooms and facilities at the intermediate high school, because it was made up to an intermediate, hopelessly inadequate. Schools overcrowded in almost every department. I did like that the West Wyalong parents and citizens are entitled to something better than the dilapidated wooden classrooms that were built in the last century or very early in this one, because after all, it's the students that are actually putting up with them. The minister listened and in 1960 said, yes, there will be a high school and it will be there by 1963. So the land was acquired near the public school, the land was disposed of near the hospital, and a high school was built. This is, remember wet photocopies? This is from that era, and as you can see, again, the private house that was there on the land was acquired to be the head's residence. There is a substantial building, so this is in 1970. The coloured blocks are, which are labelled B, are the proposed new buildings that were already being talked about. And down here at, upside down A, is a building which was moved to here from Neuera. So school buildings were moved around, particularly within inspectorates, but all around the state. As the school closed, if the building could be moved, it was in much the same way that we now have those demountables. These were sort of a forerunner of that. So now let's look at Wyalong Public School. John Anstey was the first teacher of Wyalong Public School. He was teaching at Sumarez near Armidale when he was appointed to Wyalong. So it took him from the 8th of September to the 14th of September to get to Wyalong. So he's writing to explain why that was so. Made arrangements as soon as possible to hold a sale of my effects, which was conducted on the 7th. I left Sumarez on the 8th, reached Sydney on the 10th, and then Temora on the 11th. Being married and having a family, I rented a house in Temora and was engaged during the 11th and the 12th in settling my family. Then he took the mail coach on the 13th and owing to the deplorable condition of the roads did not reach Wyalong until the 14th. On that afternoon and on the 15th, basically set about putting out the school material for use on the 17th. The Inspector Thomas, has said the country from Temora to Wyalong is in a deplorable state owing to wet weather, and that, you know, his explanation should be accepted. It was a huge thing, the movement of teachers and teachers' families around the school. Houses in a booming mining town were hard to find, and like West Wyalong, you'll see on this plan, there's the plan of the school down near Gilbert Street on the two far corners, the two WCs, and school reserve for future residents. So they've thought about it, but they haven't provided one. So Mr. Ansey rented a house in Temora for his family and he applied for rent allowance. The school was growing with an ordinary attendance of 150 students. Another teacher would have to be appointed if there was room in the school, would have been appointed, I should say, if there was room in the school building for them to teach. The house that he's got for his family is constructed of pine, walls, ceiling and floor, roof of iron, and contains 4 rooms and a kitchen in very fair state of repair. I found, upon inquiry at Temora, I found houses were not difficult to obtain owing to persons leaving for Wyalong. So I'm picturing Temora as this staging place for people moving through to the mining towns. After all of that movement and energy being expended, Mr. Anstie died in 1896 and William H. Carroll was appointed teacher to follow him. Goats were clearly a problem in both towns in the early years. As you can see here, that it's pointed out that the trees had been planted with a view to affording some shade to the children in the future, but these were being continually destroyed by the goats, which could not be kept out of the grounds owing to the absence of a proper paling fence. Some of the trees, at least. So Arbor Day was a day that's been observed in Australia since 1889 and was a worldwide movement designed to encourage people to plant trees. And as far as I can see, particularly in the early years, all New South Wales schools were involved. So I could only think that the box of trees that were planted in the grounds for Arbor Day in 1898, if the fence hadn't been fixed between then and 1896, were probably not going to have a very long life. 1899 brought typhoid to town, which combined with nearly empty tanks, because naturally the school and the residents, if there was one by that stage, were reliant on tank water, made more work for Walter Velt, who was the teacher at the time. He was boiling all of the school water, which I think is an amazing management of his time and energy, or possibly, I don't know if there was a Mrs. Velt, perhaps she was doing the boiling. On a happier note, both Wyalong and West Wyalong closed for a day in 1906 to repeat the successful 1905 Combined Sports Day. So on the left, you can see the letter of application, have the honour to apply for leave to be granted to close the public schools on Wednesday so that they may have a combined sports day in aid of school funds. The inspector says it's recommended. A similar function last year was very successful. And then lo and behold, in the school photos for West Wyalong are these fantastic photos, clearly labelled Sports Days 1906. And there's another one which is not quite a good as quality, but you'll be able to see it on the web pages. So you can see the school in the background of both of those photos, the beautifully dressed and I'm sure beautifully drilled students taking part. In 1908 and 1909, the Municipal Council wanted a range of things. So along with the PNC, the councils often have quite a bit of input through their local member in what they want. And what they wanted was a vested residence for the teacher so that they could have a married teacher. Overall, male teachers were preferred to women and married male teachers were the most preferred. They wanted a bigger school and they wanted the school that was bigger to be built of brick. So they did get additional space at the school eventually, but not before more letters describing, variously there are many letters, the children is huddled together like a lot of sheep in a crush, huddled together like sheep in a truck and packed together like sardines. The inspector adds, the population of Wyalong is likely to be permanent and there will probably be a steady increase in the attendance. The school building is one long wooden room divided by a glass partition and its dimensions are 71 feet by 20 feet by 12.5 feet. Extra accommodation for 52 pupils has already been recommended. These papers have been forwarded to the Works Department, as it appears to me that the material of which the additions should be constructed must depend largely upon the design. I recommend this matter to be referred to the architect. George V was crowned in June 1911. Remember I said even worldwide events play out their effects on schools, and the coronation was marked in a number of ways. There are local activities in which the teachers and students are involved. The schools were also allowed to close at noon on the Friday, so the teachers and others, I presume this is really just about the teachers, could catch a train to see the illuminations in Sydney. I love the letter on the right because it sounds a little bit like everyone very senior in the Department of Education has already gone off to admire the illuminations, and I'm sure the Chief Clerk is someone very important. So basically, the local member telephoned, the local school board had applied through him to have the schools at Wyalong, West Wyalong and neighbourhood closed for the afternoon, who enabled teachers to catch the afternoon train, as otherwise they would lose the opportunity of witnessing the coronation illuminations in Sydney, which I mean was a very generous thing to do. As neither the acting Under-Secretary through illness, the acting Chief Inspector, nor the Principal's Senior Inspector, owing to other engagements, were in the office at the time, I authorised Mr Kelly to inform the board that this might be granted, and now he's asking for ministerial approval. And the teachers are taking an active part in the celebration to be held in the district, which, you know, seems like nothing happened in any area without the school and the students taking part. William Moffat was the teacher, and he was absolutely in the thick of it when diphtheria broke out in Wyalong in 1913. The council were outraged when they found that they were not involved in the testing that had been done, so it kind of went from the school through the Department of Education and their medical area to the Department of Health. It's really not clear to me why there are 6 pages of detailed test results like these ones in the school file, but they provide amazing detail. So the date of notification for Mary Ellis, 23rd of August 1913. Onset of illness, 24th of August 1913. Her name is Mary Ellis. She's 28, so nothing to do with the school, it would seem. Currently at the Wyalong District Hospital, not at school. And then the milk supply. So milk is or was implicated in the spread of diphtheria. So you can see Mary Playdell at the top also got her milk from the McInnes's. Mary Ellis came from their own cow. Some are from goats. Some are from King in West Wyalong. Someone's condensed milk, own cow. It's a specific picture, but it's an amazing picture of people in the town. So the teacher, I have the honour to report that I'm forwarding per parcel a number of tubes from Dr. Robinson. I have also to report that one of the carriers, Barbara Gaddett, has left the district and was not present to have a sample taken. So the teacher had been trusted with packaging up the test tubes and posting them on. Wyalong did get additions approved, and you can see some of the sorts of things we've got here. Addition to classroom, new veranda, new stove and chimney, levelling of floors, partition removed, altered and refixed, new folding partition, doors removed and windows inserted, so on and so forth. They're quite substantial, and at times the school building was not available, and so both the Church of England and the Methodist Church were occupied as temporary school premises. On the 2nd of February. The rent for the Church of England should be paid to Dr. Shaw, and the Methodist care of this person. As the inside work of 2 of the rooms was sufficiently completed, I was able to vacate the Methodist Church on the 15th instance. I've not seen that before. Lots of halls, often the church halls, but actually to have had to have to teach in the churches. It's quite interesting. 1915, of course, was also the war. Numerous teachers enlisted, like Lancell Thrillkelled from Wyalong Public Schools. So at this point, he's care of the Church of England Tent Military Camp, Liverpool. This letter's from the school file, so I think it looks to me like there was a cheque that was supposed to be going to Private Lancell Thrillkelled. It went astray. They've issued him with a second cheque, and now the first one has arrived, so they're saying they can take the stop off that cheque. Many who returned from the war returned to teaching as well. So this is the career card of Frank Purnell. He started teaching before 1908. He was born in 1887. He was assistant master at Wagga High when he enlisted in August 1916, and on his return he was appointed as teacher at Wyalong Public School in 1919. He continued teaching through to 1951, moving on from Wyalong in 1921, where he went to Narrabri. But you'll just find this listed as just kind of a matter of course as you go through the teacher career cards. Now, Mr. Purnell, or Lieutenant Purnell, as he was at the time, put his knowledge to good use after the armistice. So he was transferred from his battalion in January 1919 to act as senior instructor in English and History, the Australian Corps Central School in France. I had no idea that that existed. He remained with the school until it was disbanded on arrival in Australia in October. The Australian Corps Central School was established with a view to preparing members of the AIF who were waiting demobilisation for such examinations as those for matriculation, civil service, accounting, etc. And then on the right is part of a memo from Mr. Purnell, where he's pointing out that, well, this seems to have been a perfectly commendable effort on the part of the Minister of Public Instruction in 1918 to not, so that the people that went and served in the war and came back to the education system as teachers weren't penalised. There seems to be some gap for people who were of the status 1B, which presumably Mr. Purnell was. So you can see set out here, born in 1887, married, service from 1902 to 1915, enlisted in, became 1B in 1915, enlisted in 1916, discharged in 1919, lists his wards. So more detailed information about how it all worked. A residence for the teacher was finally built in 1920, and this is a very small and quite boring looking plan. But obviously it was, comparatively fancy. It even had a maid's bedroom because we wanted window covers for the new school residence. The kitchen window facing east and the window of the maid's bedroom facing west are both without covers and having no protection from the sun. These rooms will be veritable furnaces in the summer. I would ask that this matter be considered. And I think he was granted his window covers. The discussion about education beyond primary class level began at least as early as 1912, which is really commendable in terms of both the department's point of view and the local people's point of view. This inspector's report on the possibility of a central school is from 1919. Part of the debate, of course, is where, as well as when. Wyalong offered super primary classes from 1920 to 1924 and naturally wanted that to continue. So this would be a report from the local inspector, Inspector Harvey, to the Chief Inspector. So at this point he's saying there's no need whatsoever, for the establishment of secondary classes at both Wyalong and West Wyalong, especially in view of the following facts. The two schools are less than 2.5 miles apart. And I also should say at this point, generally throughout the school files, you'll find that trying to get a school established within 3 miles of each other is just generally not going to happen. So it has always been a very unusual situation. With the exception of but a very insignificant number of pupils, the children live between the two schools. West Wyalong School is situated at the western extremity of the township. Wyalong School is in the centre of the township. Pupils who gain qualifying certificates at Wyalong usually remain for further education, but they do not do so at West Wyalong. In 1918, 13 pupils qualified for a qualifying certificate at Wyalong, but only 7 at West Wyalong. Present effective enrolment at Wyalong is 191, and at West Wyalong it's 233. Sixth class enrolment at West Wyalong is 40, and that at Wyalong 30. The probable qualifying certificate candidates this year from West Wyalong number 15, while from Wyalong the number is likely to be 19. So he's going through point by point, trying to make the inspect side where secondary schooling should continue. And in essence, you know, at that point, the super primary continued on at Wyalong and not at West Wyalong. Again, the local inspector reassessed the post-primary schooling decision in 1925. At the present time, the enrolments at the two schools are West Wyalong 310, Wyalong 103. Sixth classes at present are West Wyalong 38 and Wyalong 22. December 1924, 28 Wyalong. West Wyalong pupils gained their primary education certificate, while 13 did so at Wyalong. Wyalong continued as a public school and West Wyalong became the district school at this point. School life went on for Andrew McNutt, who was the headmaster at the time. He was permitted to connect the school residents with the local phone exchange at his own expense, but that must have been such a boon. The water tanks needed repairs, added the latrines, which is pretty much the story. I've spared you most of the latrines information, but it's constant. More interestingly, Mrs. McNutt decided not to continue as a sewing teacher. I suspect this is one of the reasons that towns were not the only one, but one of the reasons towns were really keen on having married teachers, because basically Mrs. Headmaster was the sewing teacher in particularly anything outside of a very large town. At this point in 1930, basically the women members of the staff can take that on. We're not going to appoint another sewing mistress, and just tell us when your wife relinquishes her duties so that the necessary salary adjustment may be made. I've not managed to find any of these heads teachers in the teacher career cards. If I have noticed, and I need to do some more research, I think it was just like they added extra money to the husband's pay packet. Each school was allowed an annual picnic day, and again, this is across the board, and how it was carried out was probably quite similar in most places. Wyalong had been combining it with Empire Day, which was not an uncommon thing to do, but had decided to separate the two. And again, it's one of those things where this decision, ostensibly about the school, really tells you about the town. At the P&C, it was resolved that a request be made for a holiday to be granted on Wednesday, the 1st of May, for the purpose of holding the school annual picnic. In the past, the picnic has been held on the afternoon of Empire Day, but the half day is not considered suitable as it can causes both the meals and the races to be hurried through. This year, I understand from newspaper reports that the Empire Day celebrations will be commemorated on the day on which it falls. As this will be a Friday, there will be added difficulty, Wednesday being half holiday and Friday being sale day, and therefore a busy day for the country people. My association will be grateful, therefore, if its desire can be granted on Wednesday the 1st May set aside as school holiday. And that's approved. So it's just what's happening in the town at that time, and this is in 1935. The Wyalong school file finishes in 1939. There's nothing beyond that. It may mean there wasn't a lot of building work went on, and also particularly in a series which is literally thousands and thousands of boxes, not everything has managed to survive. So, school files, if you're interested in other schools, you can search those through our website. The online indexes through the quick links box on the homepage. Just click on S for schools, click on schools, and then type in the name of the town. You can also search them through collection search. The school files in the index are listed as administrative files. The site register cards are a series that they use to manage the sites owned by the Department of Education and its successor agencies from approximately 1930. And if you think about it, it's a lot of land across the state. And as we've seen, they own sites which didn't end up being used for schools. They record details, so we mostly have the cards for sites that were purchased and subsequently disposed of. There's been thousands of school sites. All of the school sites in the Wyalong, West Wyalong area are still in use. So I've just included this one from Bellawee, which existed between 1920 and 1948. It was It's about 20 kilometres from West Wyalong. So the site card shows the site with a plan and how and when it was disposed of. But it's also a reminder of the many small schools that existed across New South Wales and were probably surrounded Wyalong and West Wyalong while they were growing and their towns were growing. They're all listed, so you just type in either site register and the name of a town or the series number NRS-3988. None of the cards are digitised, so you would have to organise a copy or come and see them. The photographic collection is fascinating. It's quite different to a lot of the archives we hold because it was collected by the History Unit of the Department of School Education, as it was called at that time, from around 1963 to 1991. And they used them when they were preparing school histories and research for public relations or giving presentations. So many of the photographs, and the ones I've already seen today, you can tell are not official photographs. They vary in subject, titling and image quality. It varies. Some schools there's no photos. There are photos for all three of the schools we've talked about today. So this is West Wyalong, the building, and I presume the whole school assembled in 1906. And it looks to me like this is a professional photograph, particularly with the titling. And interestingly, different titling, but same year, 1906, this and a more casual photo from Wyalong. It's kind of a similar shaped building, but smaller. And remember the sports day photos, which also looked quite professional, are from 1906. From West Wyalong High School, these are much more 70s. Just look at the pants, the hair, the car, and there's a couple of others as well. Basically, all of the photographic collection is digitised. We're just still starting to put up those later ones from the 1970s. Either just type in the name of the town with the series, or just type in the name of the town and you'll see there's a filtering device where you can just click what's digitally available. So we're going to talk about teachers lastly of all. If there were thousands of schools, there were tens of thousands of teachers. So in 1851, there were 39 teachers in New South Wales schools. By 2015, there were over 54,000 teachers in New South Wales government schools. Teachers usually spent about 3 years in a school before being moved. Some stayed much longer. Some, as you've seen, died in service. Women left once they were married. In the earlier years, basically by choice and or convention, though they didn't all leave immediately. By the 1930s, it was legislated that women must resign when they married. There was actually a Married Women Lecturers and Teachers Act. So from 1932 until 1947, you had to apply to continue to teach. There were some teachers, women who did get permission to continue teaching. As I said, male teachers, particularly married male teachers, were often favoured and requested by local people, but the thing of finding adequate accommodation was sometimes very difficult. So both of these photos are listed on our website as being West Wyalong, but I suspect, and the one on the left is also listed under Wyalong, and I think those two twin tanks are possibly Wyalong. Slightly different periods, but I included them because you can see who I presume to be in the front in the left-hand photo, a woman seated who's presumably the teacher, a temporary assistant or a pupil teacher. On the right-hand side, sorry, but on the left, there's the man with the moustache, quite possibly the head, and possibly a woman kneeling behind the little girl in the white apron who's sitting on the ground. There is a board, which is really hard to read. You might need to go onto the website to be able to actually work out. So as you've seen, the teacher career cards detail each teacher's appointments during their career and also give you some personal information. So just to look at another couple. So Margaret Crooks began teaching in 1923. She was appointed to Wyalong in 1926. Having become Mrs. Connors 2 weeks earlier, she resigned about 6 weeks later. In 1928, Mrs. Connors was re-employed as a temporary teacher, moving to West Wyalong in 1932. So I don't know, I haven't looked to see whether Milldil was anywhere in that vicinity. So was she actually living in that broad area the whole time? And taught there for over a year at West Wyalong. The bottom of this card says see casual cards, so she must have continued as a casual. Casual cards haven't been kept. On the back of her career card, the Married Women's Teachers Act is mentioned. So it tells you, you know, when she was married, which is how I know she was married 2 weeks earlier, and by who. And she was retained until the 31st of December 1933 under the Married Teachers and Lecturers Act. So perhaps she applied for some exemption, though she did resign in June. Of course, the 30s, a time of depression, and her husband may have lost his job, but then found something else. And the last teacher I just wanted to mention is Doris Margaret Osborne, or Doris Margaret Hayler nee Osborne, who, when she was appointed on, as you can see on the card on the right, as principal of West Wyalong High School in 1966, made history as the first woman principal of a co-educational high school in New South Wales. As you could see, she'd been headmistress of Blacktown Girls High and headmistress of Strathfield Girls High. So she made quite a mark. She'd had a long teaching career starting in the 1920s, having been born in 1906. Well qualified, intelligent and very engaged. She has an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biographer, listing her as a local government councillor, school principal, school teacher, trade union official and a women's activist. And there's a mention in one of the school files in the 1970s of naming the library at the high school after her. So I don't know whether that did happen, and if it did happen, is it still called after her? Finding them, so the teachers are not listed by name at the moment on our website, so if you wanted to pre-order to view in the reading room, use the series number NRS 15320 and the teacher's name, or you can order a copy through the Professions and Occupations Cards copy service for $25. So just to wrap up, I couldn't not use this plan. So this plan was drawn in 1912 by N. Needek, who was in 5th class at the Wyalong Public School, and sets out the Wyalong Public School at that time. So it was around the time when they're looking at extra buildings and expansions. You'll see there are lots of gardens marked in green. There's a tennis court, weather sheds, the outhouses, more gardens, but very nicely done, I thought. Do look at the Archives on Tour West Wyalong School Records page for all of the things that we've talked about, plus much, much more. And thank you.